French painter, illustrator and cartoonist Jules Abel Faivre was extremely popular in his lifetime, and he had a strong influence on many later European illustrators, so why there's so little information about him I can't imagine. He was born in Lyon in 1867, and he later attended the School of Fine Art there for 3 years. He then left for Paris, where he attended both the Société Nationale des Beaux-Arts and the Académie Julian. When he did eventually start working, it was as an artist, and he quickly established a reputation for his paintings, usually of attractive females. But his natural talent for comical illustration led him in 1895, when he was 28 years old, to start submitting drawings to the magazine Le Rire. And before long, rival publications such as La Bayonette and Le Figaro also began commissioning him on a regular basis. And with this obviously increasing demand for his illustrations, he allowed his art career to take a back seat. Lassiette Aubert regularly published collections of images on a particular theme by individual illustrators, and Faivre's contribution, Les Médecins, was one of the most popular. The album was a collection of frequently gruesome and sexually graphic comical cartoons with a spectacularly poor opinion of the medical profession. Faivre's work was always full of visual energy, and it's guesswork on my part, but it looks like he had more than one working method. Close examination of the work suggests that he was creating his images directly onto lithographic stone with brush and wax crayon, and the heavy texturing of some of his work supports this idea. In these cases, colour would have been added as separate lithographic print runs. But there are also examples of what looks more like pen and ink work, and the colouring seems to be applied with watercolour and pastels or crayon. When war broke out in 1914, Faivre began using his talents to create scathing caricatures of the Kaiser, many of which appeared on the cover. At 47, he was too old to fight, but in addition to this dark comic work, he produced many domestic propaganda posters. In his posters, he left the humour alone and adopted a suitably serious and accomplished representational approach to his figure work, and he used dramatic composition to underline the patriotic messages. Many of his wartime drawings were subsequently published in book form as Days of War in 1921. After the war, he created a couple of particularly attractive commercial posters, but mostly he continued with illustration for books and magazines. In the 1920s, he moved to the French Riviera town of La Croix-Valmer, but continued working as an illustrator for his Parisian clients. And although he was undoubtedly slowing down, there was no loss of quality in the illustration and paintings he created well into the 1930s. Abel Faivre died in Nice in 1945 at the age of 78, and he deserves to be far better known. In the case of Dutch illustrator Anton Peake, I may well be stretching the word unsung to its limits. Certainly in his home country he remains a household name. There's a museum dedicated to him, and his work is still published and merchandised as greeting cards, jigsaws and prints for framing. But the name doesn't mean much in Britain, and I suspect that's the case elsewhere too. He was born in 1895 in Den Helder in the Netherlands, and his twin brother Henry would go on to have a career as a painter. He studied at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts and the Pieck and Van Draghe Institute in The Hague, and following his graduation from the institute, he stayed on as a tutor until 1920. In the 1920s, he started to build a reputation for his book illustrations, and others which appeared in the children's magazine Zonneschijn. In 1929, he created a body of remarkable illustrations in both black and white and colour for C. van der Horst's Book of Heroes. The colour work displayed a facility for using watercolour, which was arguably the equal of Rackham and Heath Robinson, both of whom had influenced his style. And although the monochromes were more brutalist and drawn in pen and ink to resemble woodcuts, they were every bit as aesthetically pleasing and expressive. Peake would only ever work on projects dealing with an idealised past or ancient fantasy, and it seems he was far from comfortable with the more mechanistic aspects of 20th century life. Apparently he didn't even own a car, a radio or a TV. But having carved out this particular backward-looking niche for himself, he continued to mine its creative potential on any number of projects. In 1938 he started producing Christmas cards for a children's charity, which were typical Peake romanticised visualisations of 19th century winter scenes, and it was nostalgic illustrations such as these which led to Peake's immense popularity. Although by 1940 Holland had been occupied by the Germans, he continued to publish books. His 1940 edition of the Tales of the Brothers Grimm followed the same format as the earlier Book of Heroes, with atmospheric colour pages and line-only pages in support. And naturally his stylistic approach formed a perfect partnership with the nature of the stories. In the same year he returned to the subject of mythology for A. Van Hamel's The Garden of the Gods, and he created yet another series of dazzling and frequently disturbing dramatic images. In 1943 he created the first of an 8-volume edition of the Arabian Nights stories, and he completed the last one in 1956. To inform the visualization of these stories, Peake spent 6 weeks in North Africa sketching and making paintings of the place and the people, and this paid dividends in the plausibility of his illustrations. During World War II, he also helped the Dutch resistance by forging official documents to mislead the Nazi authorities, and at great risk to himself he hid Jewish refugees in his home. His brother was convicted of involvement with the resistance, and although sent to a concentration camp, he managed to survive. Although he was initially reluctant to get involved, between 1952, when it first opened, and 1974, Peake was responsible for designing almost every feature of the Dutch fairy tale theme park, De Efteling. The forest, the architecture and various figures and creatures used were from his drawings, and apparently Walt Disney visited it for inspiration for his own planned theme park, which was of course Disneyland, in 1955. And Peake continued to work without once recognising the present up to his death in 1987 at the age of 92. Biographical information about French children's book illustrator Adrienne Segura is extremely patchy, and other than that she was born in 1901 in Athens of French and Greek parents, there's nothing at all about her early life. In 1930 she illustrated André Maurois' book The Country of 36,000 Wishes, and a year later her own story, The Adventures of Cotonet, was published. This was popular enough to lead to another couple of books about the same character. At this time her style was based on quite simplistic line work and relatively flat application of watercolour washes. The endearing tale of Misha the Little Brown Bear followed the same pattern in 1933. From 1936 up to the outbreak of World War II, she worked full-time as the editor and illustrator for the children's pages of Le Figaro newspaper, and her next published book wasn't until 1946. In that year, A Very Little Pig Goes to School was published, and this work shows how far she'd developed the possibilities of her early technique. But only 3 years later, her style underwent a remarkable transformation. Her edition of Alice in Wonderland was published in 1949, and she was no longer recognisable as the same illustrator. She began using a particularly precise combination of line and wash, and she embellished the images further with tonal textured areas of pencil. Every one of the illustrations created for this book was incredibly detailed, and although broadly representational, the work was far from realistic, and evoked echoes of the frozen, non-naturalistic posing of medieval religious paintings. Everything she published subsequently, whether in colour or monochrome, used the same mesmerising, precise technique. Many of the usual classics of children's folk and fairy tales were reimagined by Segur, including the Brothers Grimm, Perrault, and many of the fantasy stories written by Hans Christian Andersen. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s she was extremely prolific, and particularly so when you consider how long it must have taken to create each one of these beautiful, exquisitely detailed images. Her success continued into the 1960s with yet more books such as La Rose de Noël in 1962 and Hans Andersen's The Red Shoes in 1966. She illustrated The Golden Bird in 1970, but this would turn out to be her last because not long after its publication she was tragically forced to give up work as she had become increasingly affected by arthritis and unable to draw. Adrienne Segura died in 1981 at the age of 80, and it defies all reason that a talent so distinctive and overwhelmingly attractive could now be called unsung. Paolo Gueretto was a vital figure in the 20th century's move away from representational illustration in both Europe and America, and yet he's another virtual unknown. He was born in Naples in 1903, but his family relocated to Rome when his father served as an officer in the Italian army. In 1921, Paolo enrolled at the Institute of Fine Arts in Rome to study architecture, but he spent a lot of his time at the famous Café Aragno, where he drew caricatures of the cafe's celebrity patrons. These sketches were spotted by the journalist Oreo Vigani, and through this contact Garretto was soon creating caricatures for magazines and newspapers. In his teens he had become an enthusiastic convert to the fascist ideology of Benito Mussolini, and at the age of 19 he was even chosen to be one of only 33 young men who were Mussolini's black-shirted personal guard. But a year later, in 1923, Garretto was allowed to return to his studies. Now with no interest in architecture as a career, he proceeded to find work as an illustrator, and in addition to work for various magazines, he soon became a popular choice for advertising work. Stylistically, he'd picked up on the influence of the art movement Futurism, but its angular dynamics were tempered with great visual humour. Nevertheless, he was pioneering a modernist approach few other illustrators in Italy had yet woken up to. Garretto frequently used an airbrush in the creation of his distinctive illustrations, but many of his images are better described as mixed media, as he also employed crayon, gouache, coloured pencil and even collage in his pictures. During the 1920s he tried a couple of times to attract the attention of the Parisian publishing and poster industry, but it took until 1930 before he was able to break into that overcrowded market. So he relocated to the French capital to exploit his newfound popularity. But within only a couple of years he started to get commissions from America, and he promptly headed for New York. Among other commissions, he was invited to create a series of covers for the business magazine Fortune, all of which featured his immaculately composed, radically abstracted images during the 1930s. These were an early challenge to the dominance of representational painting in the American media. And his humorous side, including a few caricatures of the famous and infamous, was showcased in a series of stylish and distinctive covers for the magazine Vanity Fair during the same decade. When war broke out in 1939, he returned to his home country, but he steadfastly and bravely refused demands to create caricatures of the Allied leaders for propaganda purposes. He was consequently branded a dissident and deported and imprisoned in Hungary until 1942. When the war was over, he managed to rebuild his career, and he carried on working in magazines and advertising, and even branched out into children's book illustration. But despite his reputation and the modernity of his style, he couldn't recapture his previous level of success. In later life, Paolo Gueretto relocated to Monte Carlo, and he died there in 1989 at the age of 86. Which draws this instalment to a close, and I hope I'll see you next time around.